Alright, so I'm going to be giving a presentation on blind sight, which is a colloquial term that widely references visual reflexes and orientation, visual orientation, that is. So that specific combination is found in people who are what is specifically cortically blind. Now, blindness can come in multiple forms. There's macular degeneration, and people who have that can't generate blind sight. However, in my presentation I'm going to be referring to cortical blindness only, which is damage to the primary visual cortex and the occipital lobe, so bear that in mind. So when the primary visual cortex is sufficiently impaired as to disable conscious visual processing, this doesn't actually damage a subject's ability to unconsciously visually process. And by that I mean there are more parts to vision than simply consciously processing things. So a researcher named A.O. Ham and his associates did a test or a study on somebody rendered traditionally cortically blind via a stroke, causing severe damage to V1. And that person was still able to predict the occurrence of an aversive electric shock from visual cues. Bear in mind, this person is cortically blind. He can't actually physically see. But they placed a visor on his face, and they would show him an image, and I believe it was an image of an airplane, and that image would be immediately followed by an electric shock to the arm. Then they would show him another image, and they would just press the cold electrode to his arm. And they would continue to do this, and after a few times, he would show physiological reaction to the image of the airplane. He can't see. He is cortically blind, and yet his brain could still detect that this shape and image was related to this electrical shock. So this was done. This was a fear conditioning test whether or not someone who's cortically blind can still be conditioned, which they can. Meaning that at the very least, for fear conditioning, the learned reaction is unconscious on most levels. So that's a brief overview. You have the cortical blindness of in the V1, which, since it's only in the primary visual cortex, that does not cause damage to the thalamus or the extrastriate cortex or the superior colliculus, which is where we find orientation and visual reflex. This is called the extrageniculate pathway. Now, and it's the part of the brain that neurologists theorize control this unconscious system of recognition. It's via multiple areas. But one of the first ones that you'll find is the extrastriate cortex. It's what detects motion, generally in your periphery. So when you see something move, you haven't actually seen it. If someone were to ask you what you specifically saw, you wouldn't really be able to tell them anything detailed. But you detected motion over here, so you can. So that's your extrastriate cortex in action. It's detecting motion. It also recognizes the human form. So you might be able to say, well, I saw a person move on this side, but that's all you'd be able to give. You won't be able to give hair color or, whether they're necessarily fat, thin, tall, short, nothing like that. On the other hand, once you detect that motion, your superior colliculus produces what's called a gaze shift. It's a reflexive action that when your brain detects something that might be either interesting or possibly dangerous, you move and you shift your gaze and you look at whatever it was that you detected, or your extrastriate cortex detected anyway. So there's also activation in the amygdala. The amygdala is, you might recognize, as part of the brain that handles some of the more primal aspects of the brain. So you have something like So it's like a aggression, fear response, fight or flight, those kinds of things. That's what you'll find the amygdala activating in. And a researcher, De Gelder, I believe, was running a test to see if they could trigger the amygdala in somebody who was blind. Now, the subject in this case had blindness in their left hemifield, and so there was damage to the left occipital lobe, and so they would show them an image just in their blind hemifield, and the image would be of a human face showing, anger or fear, and despite this being them having cortical blindness in this part of in this eye, they were still able to see activation in the amygdala in reaction to this image of anger or fear, meaning that the brain could still detect it, even though there was no actual visual processing. So moving on from that, it is important to make the distinction between what's called visual function and visual experience. Visual experience is what you think of when you think of actually seeing something. You're visually processing it and you're consciously experiencing the visual input. People can still have visual function without having visual experience. In this case, with the extrageniculate pathway, you still have the function of detecting something via your eyes, but you can't visually experience it. So, an interesting study to point out was done actually in 1986 by M. Faber-Thorpe, and it was conducted concerning the role of the extrageniculate pathway in visual guidance. She theorized that this extra pathway, this parallel pathway, existed autonomously. So it existed much like the enteric system, the enteric nervous system, if it existed outside of the control of the primary visual pathway. So, and this is the pathway that is utilized by patients who possess blind sight. It uses sensory neurons, makes use of a semi-redundant parallel pathway by passing through the thalamus, but not through the lateral geniculate. That's where the term comes from, extrageniculate, outside of the geniculate. And there's a great deal of interest in this. So, to tie this to Ramachandran introduced us to a woman who, despite her cortical blindness, was able to put a letter into a mail slot with precision, the kind of precision you expect from someone who can see. This woman is cortically blind, so she couldn't. Combining what we know that this woman detected the orientation of the mail slot using her extrageniculate pathway, detecting it with the extrastriate cortex and the superior colliculus to determine orientation, orienting the hand in the path that it would need to appropriately place the letter in the slot, and guiding that hand with minute precision, the kind you would expect from someone who could see. Jason Holt wrote a book called Blind Sight and the Nature of Consciousness, where he discusses how the nature of consciousness is related to those who literally, when you can't see, but you can still experience. What does that say about our consciousness? It's a very interesting book, and I definitely say you should check it out if you have any interest in this. But he takes pains to reinforce that blind sight is almost assuredly V1 independent, since this can exist in somebody who has severe damage to their primary visual cortex, which supports the '86 study by Thorpe. So, that being said, just to recap, cortical blindness, it is important to make the distinction between cortical blindness and blindness resulting from macular degeneration or any damage to the retinal nerve. And the blind sight still needs those parts intact in order to occur. So, really only in cortical blindness will this happen. But when it does happen, one's ability to orient and to react reflexively to visual stimuli remains intact, which I think is incredibly fascinating. And that's it. Thank you for listening.